My name is Lucy Armstrong, and I was 27 when everything began shifting in ways I couldn't name. I entered my husband's family with a kind of cautious hope, the kind that grows out of wanting to belong without demanding space. They were polite, always measured, their smiles soft but distant, as if they were greeting someone who might not stay long. In those early months, I convinced myself their reserve was simply unfamiliarity. I tried small gestures, helping in the kitchen, asking gentle questions, remembering details they mentioned in passing. None of it was rejected, yet nothing seemed to land. Their responses hovered at the edge of formality, never hostile, never warm, creating a space where I was present but never quite received. I told myself to be patient. Families had rhythms, and I was still learning theirs. My husband assured me they needed time, that they were careful with new people. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the slight pauses before they answered me, or the way conversations drifted around my presence, were unintentional. For a while, that explanation felt safe enough. But small things began pressing through the silence. Moments so subtle I almost missed them. A shared glance when I offered to help. A group message thread I was accidentally left out of. Conversations that softened or shifted the moment I stepped into the room, leaving me standing there with the faint sense that I had interrupted something important. I told myself these things happened in every family, that people forgot details or assumed someone else had already reached out. I tried to compensate by being more present, offering help before it was needed, showing up early, staying late, and learning their preferences one by one. In my mind, effort translated to belonging, and if I worked hard enough, they would eventually meet me halfway. But the harder I tried, the thinner the connection felt, like I was pressing my hands against frosted glass, seeing shapes but never warmth. When decisions were made without me, I told myself it wasn't intentional. When they exchanged quiet glances during meals, I tried to believe it had nothing to do with me. My husband insisted they were simply private people, and I clung to that explanation because it kept me from acknowledging the disappointment settling in my chest. Still, there were moments that lingered longer than they should have. The way they hesitated before acknowledging me, the way invitations came through my husband but never directly to me, the way my presence seemed to bend the energy of a room without ever truly entering it. Each instance could be explained away, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. And then, one afternoon, I walked in on a conversation that stopped so abruptly it left the air trembling. Their silence wasn't confusion, it was coordination, and something in me finally registered. Their family had an order to it, one I hadn't noticed at first. Everyone understood their place, their roles, and the unspoken rules that held everything together. I assumed I would eventually learn where I fit, but over time it became clear they had already assigned me a position. I was placed at the outer ring, acceptable enough to be included physically, but never woven into anything meaningful. My husband shifted in small, unsettling ways. Whenever I tried explaining the discomfort settling in my chest, he gave me a gentle smile, a soft sigh, or a reminder that I tended to overthink. He said it with affection, as if he were offering comfort, but it left me feeling unheard. Each conversation ended before it truly began, and I learned to swallow the questions forming inside me. I picked up the emotional labor the family didn't want to hold, bridging silences, smoothing tension, carrying the weight of their indifference without complaint. The imbalance revealed itself more sharply during a family dinner. I expected to sit beside my husband, as I always had, but when I arrived, the seat was already taken. A cousin I barely knew sat in my usual place, chatting comfortably. My husband motioned toward an empty chair at the far end of the table, offering no explanation. The shift was so subtle it could have been denied, yet unmistakable in its intention. I took the distant seat, folding myself into the space they left for me. All evening, conversations moved around me like a current I wasn't meant to enter. When plans were made, holidays, events, choices that affected everyone, they happened swiftly, without pause for my presence. I nodded, smiled, and pretended not to notice when my suggestions dissolved before reaching the center of the room. The message was quiet but firm. I was there to observe, not participate. Driving home afterward, the silence between my husband and me felt different, heavy. I replayed the night, realizing these moments weren't isolated. They formed a design, careful, consistent, and deeply intentional. For the first time, the blame I kept turning inward loosened its hold. A quiet question rose within me, steady and honest, wondering whether their distance reflected something about who I was or something they were determined to keep hidden. That thought lingered longer than I expected, settling into a space I could no longer ignore, reshaping the way I watched everything that followed. It was the first shift that made me look deeper than before. There's a particular kind of silence that doesn't soothe, but erodes, and theirs settled around me in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't loud or hostile. It was measured, consistent, and quietly corrective, as if reminding me that every thought I had needed reevaluation. I found myself doubting my own perceptions, replaying moments in my mind and searching for faults that might justify the distance they maintained. It became easier to assume I had misread something than to believe an entire family could hold me at arm's length with such deliberate calm. Their micro-rejections were subtle enough to be dismissed, but frequent enough to leave marks. A comment ignored here, a glance exchanged there, an invitation mentioned casually as though I'd somehow forgotten I wasn't included. When I brought these moments to my husband, he reassured me with gentle certainty that his parents were simply private people, that I needed to give them more time, that I tended to see patterns where none existed. His tone was protective, but it left me feeling smaller, as though my own experiences required his validation to be real. I began withdrawing without meaning to. In social settings, I found myself stepping back, letting others speak, making myself easy to overlook because it felt less painful than trying to enter conversations that closed the moment I approached. I felt invisible in a way that didn't come from being ignored outright, but from being treated as though I were slightly out of focus, present but not essential. Their silence became a kind of pressure, one that tightened slowly, leaving me with the sense that I was always one misstep away from confirming whatever assumptions they held about me. I carried the weight of this uncertainty quietly. My thoughts grew softer, my confidence diluted by constant second-guessing. Even in my own home, I felt myself shrinking, holding parts of myself back, because the more authentic I tried to be, the more out of place I seemed to become. I told myself this was temporary, that the discomfort was simply an adjustment period I needed to endure. Still, a quiet heaviness began settling beneath my ribs, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but gradually shapes the way you breathe. And then, unexpectedly, a small detail disrupted the pattern, an inconsistency in their behavior, so slight it might have gone unnoticed. It didn't align with the coldness I had come to accept. For the first time, instead of feeling hurt, I felt something shift inside me. Not clarity yet, but the faint beginning of curiosity, as if a thread had loosened just enough for me to see there was more beneath their silence than I'd allowed myself to consider. Something in me shifted once the confusion settled into a quieter kind of awareness. I realized reacting only fed the uncertainty I had been living in, so I began doing the one thing I had avoided from the beginning: watching. I let myself fall back into silence, not the defeated kind, but the steady, deliberate quiet that allows you to see what people try to hide. It didn't take long for patterns to emerge. They had rhythms I had missed before, small movements and glances that carried meaning when examined closely, hushed phone calls that ended a second too quickly when I walked in, conversations that shifted course with almost graceful speed the moment my presence brushed against them, doors that remained closed during visits, always with a reason that sounded prepared rather than genuine. I noticed how protective they were of certain documents, always stacking papers in neat piles the moment I entered the room, as if my eyes might land somewhere they shouldn't. And when outsiders appeared, neighbors, distant relatives, acquaintances, they behaved with an alertness that contrasted sharply with their indifference toward me. It wasn't warmth, it was vigilance, as if other people posed a risk only they understood. The more I observed, the more deliberate their behavior seemed. They weren't simply private, they were guarding something, shaping their interactions with a caution that felt practiced. I found myself cataloging moments without meaning to, collecting small pieces that didn't yet form an answer, but created a quiet sense of unease. My silence stopped feeling like surrender and began to feel like a vantage point. I watched the way their eyes shifted during conversations, how quickly they dismissed certain topics, how easily they redirected attention away from anything that hinted at vulnerability. It became clear their unity wasn't rooted in closeness, but in mutual protection. And though I still didn't know what they were protecting, I felt the outline of it taking shape. The turning point came quietly, almost unremarkably. A letter misdelivered to our address, tucked between ordinary mail, carrying a name I recognized but details that didn't match their stories. It wasn't dramatic, but it lingered. It didn't align with the guarded harmony they maintained, and something inside me shifted from hurt to quiet curiosity. It was the first hint that their silence was not just exclusion, it was protection, and I had finally brushed against the edge of whatever they were trying so hard to keep unseen. I held the envelope longer than necessary, feeling an unexpected steadiness settle over me. It wasn't relief or fear, but a recognition that my understanding had shifted in a way I couldn't undo. Their behavior no longer felt like a reflection of my inadequacy. It felt like a barrier built with intention. Instead of shrinking beneath the weight of their distance, I found myself leaning into the questions it raised. Something about the letter unsettled the careful structure around me, and for the first time, I wanted to know what lay beneath it for myself. The letter stayed with me longer than it should have, its tone strangely urgent, its contents vague enough to raise questions, but specific enough to unsettle something deep inside me. It referenced an account I had never heard of, tied to a name my husband once mentioned only in passing. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it where no one would think to look. Silence, I had learned, revealed more than any direct question ever could. From that point on, the small irregularities I'd noticed began arranging themselves into something more coherent: a missing file from a drawer they guarded carefully, a phone call cut short, followed by a strained expression they tried to mask, a document left face down on a table, with edges worn from being handled too often. None of it made sense on its own, but together they formed a pattern that hinted at something heavier than simple family privacy. I began piecing things together quietly, never altering my behavior enough to draw attention. The inheritance they rarely spoke of, the family business they described with careful vagueness, the distant relative who seemed more like a threat than kin. And underneath all of it, a financial trail that didn't align with the life they portrayed. Assets moved abruptly, accounts opened and closed without explanation, property transferred between names with a kind of haste that suggested fear rather than strategy. Their hostility toward me began to make a different kind of sense. It wasn't about my personality or my presence. It wasn't about incompatibility or the slow warming they claimed to need. It was panic, controlled, quiet, and deeply ingrained. I wasn't being shut out because I didn't belong. I was being kept away because they couldn't risk an outsider seeing what lay beneath their careful facade. Once I understood that, something inside me grew still. The confusion that had once felt like fog began to clear, replaced by a steadiness I hadn't expected. I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel vindicated. What I felt was distance, clean, quiet, and liberating in a way I hadn't anticipated. Their secret had nothing to do with me, yet it shaped every interaction I'd been questioning. The emotional weight I had carried alone suddenly felt lighter, as though I had been holding a burden that was never mine. I stopped trying to solve the parts that didn't fit. I didn't search for more letters or look deeper into documents. I didn't want revenge, and I didn't want to expose them. I wanted only to protect the small, steady sense of clarity that had begun forming inside me. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to their silence or trying to earn a place within it. I was simply seeing them as they were, without the layers of self-blame I had wrapped around every moment. That shift, quiet as it was, changed everything that followed. Once the truth settled into place, something in me went still. I stopped waiting for warmth that was never coming. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never be heard. The quiet I carried shifted from uncertainty to intention, and without announcing anything, I stepped back from the center of a family that had never wanted me there. It wasn't a performance, it was simply the absence of effort, the release of a role I had been straining to fill. I moved differently after that, slower, more deliberate, as if giving myself permission to observe without participating. Their conversations no longer held weight for me. Their glances no longer cut the way they once did. I felt myself detach, not out of anger, but out of clarity. They had built walls to keep me out, and for the first time, I let them stand without trying to push my way through. Quietly, I began taking precautions. I reviewed our finances with a calm, methodical eye, noting every account, every transfer, every document that carried my name. I made copies of anything that felt important, storing them in places no one else would think to look. Not because I planned to use them, but because security, my own security, had suddenly become something I could no longer outsource to trust. I documented the inconsistencies I stumbled upon, not obsessively, but with a steady hand. Dates, names, transactions, small details they might assume I would never notice. I didn't intend to expose anything, I simply wanted a record, a quiet safeguard against the unsettling possibility that their secret could someday pull me into its shadow. My husband didn't notice the shift in me, or if he did, he mistook it for exhaustion, offering soft reassurances that slid off me without leaving a mark. His passivity no longer hurt, it only confirmed how alone I had been, long before I realized it. I wasn't cold, I was simply done performing warmth for people who viewed my presence as risk. I attended family gatherings with a polite smile, contributed nothing unnecessary, and faded into the background with an ease that surprised even me. I offered no confrontation, no questions, no reactions. My absence wasn't physical, it was emotional, a quiet retreat from a battlefield I no longer felt obligated to step onto. And in that silence, something began to shift on their side, not loudly, not immediately, but in small, telling ways. A tension that surfaced in their voices, a misstep in their stories, a momentary lapse in their usual coordination. The consequences, it seemed, were beginning to move on their own, without a single word or gesture from me. All I did was step back, and in that distance, the structure they had built so carefully began to tremble at its edges. The unraveling didn't begin with an accusation or a confrontation. It began with something small, an inquiry letter addressed to my husband's father, forwarded through the wrong channel, landing in the hands of someone who didn't know how to keep quiet. From there, it moved with a quiet inevitability, a routine audit that stopped being routine, a relative asking questions they weren't supposed to ask, a story told twice with details that no longer aligned. Their secret, so carefully guarded, had begun to leak through the seams they thought were invisible. I wasn't involved in any of it. I didn't make calls or send documents. I didn't hint, suggest, or step into the unfolding chaos. I simply watched from a distance, the same way they had taught me to observe without belonging. At first, there was confusion, muted concern, quick glances exchanged at family gatherings, conversations that ended the moment anyone approached. Then came the tension, the subtle shift in tone when they spoke to one another, as though each word carried weight they weren't willing to name. Their unity began to fracture under the pressure. The same people who once moved with synchronized caution now stumbled over their own narratives. Blame surfaced in careful increments, a misplaced document, a phone call not returned in time, a decision made without proper consultation. They tried to contain it, but their attempts had the frantic edge of people who no longer trusted the stability of what they had built. I stayed silent. I didn't offer comfort or questions. I didn't ask for updates or explanations. My distance, once forced upon me, now became a protective space, a vantage point that kept me steady while they scrambled for control. Watching them turn inward, directing their panic at each other, made something clear. They had never feared me. They had feared exposure, and now that exposure was unfolding from within their own walls. The more strained their interactions became, the quieter I grew. Silence, the same tool they had used to push me out, now became the boundary that kept me safe. I saw the cracks widen, not because I had done anything, but because the truth they tried to bury refused to stay still. Their implosion was slow, almost dignified at first, then increasingly desperate as the consequences became unavoidable. And in that quiet distance, I realized something I hadn't understood before. Justice doesn't always arrive with force. Sometimes it emerges through stillness, through the simple act of stepping back and letting people face the weight of what they created. My silence, once a wound, had become its own form of protection, and in a way I hadn't expected, it became the clearest form of justice they would ever receive. They reached out to me in ways they never had before: careful messages, unexpected visits, questions wrapped in politeness that felt newly practiced. It was clear they were searching for reassurance, for some sign that I might soften the edges of the situation closing in around them. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. Their urgency no longer pulled at me the way it once would have. I listened, nodded, and offered only the bare minimum, not out of cruelty, but because I no longer felt responsible for the weight they carried. Their chaos contrasted sharply with the calm that had settled over my life. I moved through conversations with a steadiness that seemed to unsettle them. They looked at me differently now, not as an outsider they could dismiss, but as someone whose quiet made them uneasy. The balance between us had changed without a single confrontation. I had become centered in myself, while they were losing the ground beneath their feet. My husband watched me with a soft confusion, as though trying to understand when I had slipped beyond his reach. He asked if I was upset, if something had happened, if he had missed a moment that mattered. I answered gently, giving him nothing to grasp onto. I no longer needed explanations from him, nor did I owe him any of my own. Emotional distance had become a form of clarity, and clarity had become a kind of peace. They tried pressing closer, sharing fragments of their worries, hinting at conflicts unfolding within the family, searching for sympathy I no longer had to offer. I didn't reject them, I simply didn't step toward them. My silence was no longer defensive, it was intentional, a boundary that formed naturally once I stopped trying to belong where I had never been welcome. And standing in that quiet, I realized the reversal wasn't about power in the traditional sense. It was about space, about finally occupying my own life without shrinking to fit theirs. Their unraveling no longer felt connected to me, and for the first time, I could see everything with a clarity untouched by hurt. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking less about what had happened to them and more about what had happened to me. Being shut out had felt like rejection for so long, but with distance, I began to understand how it had also been a kind of protection. Their walls, meant to keep me at a distance, had kept me from being pulled into something I was never meant to carry. I hadn't been spared intentionally, but I had been spared all the same. I started rebuilding quietly, in ways that didn't need to be announced. Therapy helped me hear my own voice again, the one I had softened to accommodate everyone else. Boundaries became less of a defense and more of a way to honor the space I had reclaimed. I learned to choose where my energy went, and for the first time, I chose myself without apology. My life didn't transform dramatically, it simply became steadier, more honest, more mine. I didn't follow the details of their unraveling. When fragments reached me through others, I let them pass without attachment. I didn't feel satisfaction, and I didn't feel pity. What happened to them wasn't my doing, and it wasn't my burden. Truth has a rhythm of its own, one that doesn't require force to surface. It moves quietly, patiently, until it finds the cracks that were always there. My husband struggled with the distance between us, trying to bridge it with questions he had never asked before. I answered kindly, but I no longer contorted myself to ease his discomfort. Whatever came next for us would need to be built on something sturdier than denial, and that was a truth we both had to face without pretending. Looking back, I don't see a story of triumph. I see a story of clarity, slow, quiet, and unexpectedly freeing. I entered their family hoping to belong, and I left with a deeper understanding of myself instead. Peace didn't arrive as a victory, it arrived as a steady acceptance, a soft exhale after holding my breath for far too long. And in that calm, I finally felt whole.